Hi, this is Mahayogi again. We were discussing the basic principles of yoga with a view to understanding what I'm calling yoga vision. Actually, there's a Sanskrit word for that, which is drishti. Drishti means vision, but more on that later. Let's just talk about basic principles. So, we were talking about the Eightfold Path. The first principle on the Eightfold Path is called yama. The word yama means rules, regulations. In order that one have a satisfied mind, one needs to follow a certain regimen, a certain kind of discipline. Before entering into the practice of meditation, we need to free our consciousness from its absorption in the lower self. The idea is to find harmony between the body, the mind, and the higher self. And this harmony is not possible as long as we're absorbed in sensual pleasure. Now, this doesn't mean that we live a life of complete self-abnegation. Pleasure is a natural thing, it's part of life. But when we become obsessed with sensual pleasure, we tend to forget the self. And so the yoga practice involves freeing the mind from distractions. We're always distracted by sex, money, and power. Like there's a section in the brain for sex, a section for money, and they're always firing and saying, I need more sex, I need more money. Where is food? So as long as we're absorbed in the senses and the sensual pleasures, the mind is not free to center itself on contemplation. So freeing the mind is possible through a certain amount of self-regulation. Now, according to the law of karma, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and that means the more that we involve ourselves in sensual pleasure, the more we expose ourselves to sensual pain. It's something like if you have a skin infection and you want to scratch and itch. It's not good for you to do that because by scratching the itch you make the infection worse. But when you scratch the itch, you get enormous pleasure. And you can continue scratching and scratching until you flay your skin off and it's pink. But the only result is more pain. So there's a direct relationship between pleasure and pain, just as there's a relationship between action and reaction in karma. So I'm not advocating that we run away from pleasure or that we run away from pain. But what I'm trying to point out here is that as long as the mind is exclusively involved in chasing after the pleasure of the senses, it will be also involved in experiencing pain. This was a subject that was really concentrated on by the Buddha, and we'll talk about the Eightfold Path of Buddhism and how it's connected to the Eightfold Path of Yoga later. But if you think about rules for life, or yama, which is what I'm talking about, the first principle to be followed in self-regulation, or yama, is really non-violence. Non-violence to yourself, but also non-violence towards others. Because when you're violent against others in thought, word, or deed, the reaction will come to you in the form of karma. So, in order to begin to discover the inner peace of yoga, we need to practice peace and nonviolence in our dealings with other people. And I can give you a very simple exercise, if you like. See if you can go through the rest of the day without getting angry with others. Just try it for 24 hours. It's nice if you keep a calendar, you can put a little green dot on today. If you make it through the day without getting angry with someone. And then try it again tomorrow. Put a little green dot on your calendar tomorrow if you can make it through tomorrow without getting angry. And tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. And see how long you can go. When I say not getting angry, there's of course 3 levels of action. One is physical, one is verbal, and one is mental. So to be physically angry with someone is to be violent, and that's a very extreme level of anger. Verbal anger is much more common, and in the course of a day, it's very common for us to express anger on a verbal level with other people. But even a higher level of control is to become free from mental anger. And this requires a certain amount of mind control on your own part. But the best form of mind control here is compassion. If you can see how others are really suffering, then you won't provoke more suffering. You won't become angry with them because you understand how they're also suffering. So this principle of nonviolence is a very important first principle in the practice of yoga. And the principles of yoga we call niyama. The principle of nonviolence extends as well to our animal friends. And for this reason, those who seriously practice yoga avoid meat eating. Because just as much as a truth seeker wants peace with his fellow human beings, a yogi avoids cruelty to animals. So this is a very basic first principle, the idea of non-violence. And without following these basic principles, it's not really possible to still the mind. As long as you're expressing anger and cruelty to others, whether that be physically, verbally, or even mentally, it will be impossible to experience the inner serenity that comes with meditation upon the higher self. Then again, another of the distractions that prevent us from meditating or contemplating on the higher self is the sexual principle. Men are attracted to women, women are attracted to men, and this attraction is a wonderful thing. It's beautiful. And yet, look at any romantic comedy or romantic tragedy, Romeo and Juliet. The sexual principle, the attraction between men and women, can often lead us into romantic entanglements which deviate the mind from contemplation of the soul. And so for this reason, the practitioner of yoga must learn to control the erotic impulse. Because without controlling the erotic principle, the practice of yoga meditation will really be impossible. If you go to a yoga class and you're looking at the young ladies there in their tight outfits and thinking about their bodies then you're not making progress in your yoga practice. So for this reason, adultery, illicit and immoral sexual acts are avoided by the yogis insofar as lust and desire corrupt spiritual life. So this again falls under the heading of yama, or regulative principles, in order to free oneself from hatred, anger, cruelty, sensual obsession. It's important for one to try to live a regulated life. Now, we're not talking about extreme self-abnegation, but look at the path of the great yogis and you'll see what I mean. All of this also can be understood through the instructions of one's teacher or guru. For the same reason as the above mentioned, that is, trying to keep the mind peaceful, a practitioner of yoga should avoid intoxication. And this means intoxication by alcohol or other drugs that may distort the mind and agitate the senses. This can include psychedelic drugs, marijuana, LSD, ecstasy, a whole host of different drugs that we use to calm the mind. In a sense, the action of these drugs has more to do with anesthesia than it does with self-realization. We suffer so much internally as a consequence of modern civilization that anesthesia becomes pleasing. It becomes a goal in life. Before, the different sorts of maladies that came to us externally, even today, in the form of viruses and bacteria. But with the pressure of modern life, many illnesses come from our own self, insofar as we're repressing our spiritual life. People suffer from mental problems, ADHD, attention deficit disorders, paranoia, schizophrenia, epilepsy, all different sorts of psychological and psychiatric disorders. I'm not a scientist in this, but insofar as trauma can produce psychological disorder, we experience a certain amount of trauma by being alienated and disconnected from our own spiritual self. And there's no need to aggravate the problem through intoxication and alcohol or other drugs that distort the mind and agitate the senses. So this is all part of yama, trying to lead a regulated life. Another aspect of discipline would be avoidance of greed. If you think of lust, anger, greed, pride, illusion, and envy as the source of many of our different problems, greed has an internal and external aspect. Internally, greed is never satisfied. No matter how much you have, you want more. So greed in business practices, speculation, dishonesty, destroy spiritual life, and these things are also harmful for others. So what I'm saying here is the avoidance of lust, the avoidance of greed, the avoidance of cruelty are very important principles. This is yama and also niyama. Niyama means avoidance. So yama means positive practices that we can accept, and niyama means negative practices we should give up. It's a little bit of the same thing. But if by yama we mean accept a vegetarian diet, by niyama we mean avoid cruelty to animals. If by yama we mean chastity, niyama would mean avoid promiscuity, like that. So yama and niyama, the do's and don'ts of yoga, they sort of amount to the same thing. They're different sides of the same coin. The idea is that a yogi should be pure in thought and deed. And we're not talking about religious purity here. This is not an ideology. We're not promoting a sectarian view. Purity in thought involves becoming aware of your own spiritual self and the spiritual self that's found in others, becoming aware of divinity within. One's ethical behavior, one's actions and deeds, then, should follow from the purity of thought. One who's in connection with the Atma will understand the difference between right and wrong and how to develop the proper rules of conduct. In this way, a yogi strives for purity of body and mind above and beyond the rules. We're not following rules simply because they're in a book. The idea is that for contemplation of the self, it's necessary to become centered on the self, to see things from a more spiritual point of view, which is my topic here. I'm talking about yoga vision. So the yogi strives for purity, and this implies a contemplative life of self-discipline, free from violence, anger, cruelty, hatred, lust, and greed. And this may be developed through self-analysis, a certain amount of self-abnegation in the sense of avoiding being too obsessed with the body and its demands, and developing the ability to focus on the higher self. And this will be facilitated through dedication to the teachings of one's spiritual master, one's guru, because sooner or later it's difficult to progress alone, and one will need to form a connection with a higher authority, one who's gone further down the path, as I explained in my last talk. And this will lead one higher. These ideas are called yama and niyama. So we'll come back to this later. I've spoken enough for today. Thanks for joining us. It's good to see you again. And stay tuned. Hi, my name is Maha Yogi. I'm going to talk a little bit about yoga and its philosophy, its vision. Yoga vision is best described as a kind of X-ray vision. You could call it a way of seeing into soul consciousness. Now, a lot of people don't like the whole notion of consciousness, and they see this as magical thinking. But in the East, and especially in India, the Atma, or consciousness, is considered self-evident, and without any further discussion about whether we exist or not, we can assume that the soul indeed exists, and that it's called the Atma, and it's possible to see into a higher reality with the eye of the Atma, the third eye, if you like. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to develop this kind of vision. So, first I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'm not here to take your money or get famous. I'm trying to share what I've learned from my guru, and many people have asked me to do that. My guru is no longer with us. His name was Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Dev Goswami, highly erudite Vaishnava guru in Bengal. I had the distinction of knowing him and learning from him. And many people have asked me, what can you tell us about those teachings? What was your takeaway? So, without expecting anything in return, I'm trying to describe a little bit about what I learned. I don't claim to be a master, in other words. I think that some people who represent themselves as masters are only fools in disguise, because a true master maintains his curiosity. A true teacher remains a student. So, as a student who's trying to make progress on the path, I think that good students also learn by teaching. And I'm trying to share what I learned from my teacher. I hope it'll be useful to you, and I'm happy that you're taking a couple of minutes to listen to me. I've been studying these yoga ideas for a long time, since the 1960s, and yet they seem to me ever fresh, because they're very deep and not merely ideas, but they're the key to a way of seeing things. And vision is important. We don't want to walk around blind, but sometimes we're blinded by materialistic desire, by the pull of our senses, by our inability to control the mind. So I'm speaking here as a friend who spent some time on the path. Maybe I can see a bit farther down the road. It's always a pleasure for me to connect with sincere souls, sincere young folks like yourselves, and maybe we can learn something together. So, how to look at the world through the lens of yoga, or what I'm going to call yoga vision. The idea is to go beyond a superficial or perfunctory understanding. What can we see with our physical senses, with the vegetable eye? We know that yoga is a great way to stay fit, to stay flexible physically, to tune the instrument, which is the human body. And there are lots of different systems for teaching yoga now. Iyengar, integral yoga, Kriya yoga. We have an International Yoga Day where millions of people celebrate the yoga asanas of the morning sun meditation. The benefits of yoga exercise are great and well known. I know this. I'm still fit after 66 years. But yoga is not simply a question of doing exercise. The instrument we tune is not simply this material body made of flesh, bone, and muscle. We also have to keep in mind the mental construct. We need to tune the mind, for the body is dependent on the mind. And what about the soul, the Atma, the spiritual entity that gives life to the body and energy to the mind? In a strict sense, all the yoga paths are meant to bring body, mind, and spirit together in harmony, not simply to adjust or align the bone and muscle of the physical body. This harmony is impossible without cultivating the correct vision, the right way of seeing things. So this is what I'd like to explain a little bit about. The idea of yoga vision comes from the original yoga system as it was practiced in India for thousands of years, since the Vedic times. The yoga system was encoded by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras and conceived of as an eightfold path. If you study these things, you'll find that the ancient yoga system mirrors the eightfold path of the Buddha. But there are some important distinctions, as we'll see as we go along. The Eightfold Path has 4 pairs. These are asana, which means postures, sitting postures, different poses. Yama, rules. Niyama, sort of anti-rules. It means rules and regulations for living. Pranayam is breath control, and pratyahara means leaving behind of unwanted things. There's dharana and dhyan, which are different forms of meditation. And finally, samadhi, which is illumination. Now, this sounds a little technical, but it's worth considering in detail. You advanced yoga students out there will understand my point of reference here, but even if you're an expert, you might profit from the explanation, because true yogis are always open to reflection. So stay tuned, you may learn something new. Newer students may have heard of the Eightfold Path, but it remains quite mysterious. The idea is that by proper practice, not just physical diet and exercise, but right vision, mindfulness, and meditation will bring us into harmony. So just as there are principles of harmony in music, rhythm, melody, counterpoint, and so on, there are principles in yoga which will help us tune our instruments. Now, the correct practice of this Eightfold Yoga path is not easy, and it'll take a bit of explanation. I'll continue this in my next talk. But before entering into the details, it's worth mentioning that it's important to develop a means for maintaining the mind in balance, controlling the mind. Because only when one's mind is correctly focused on the Atma, or spiritual reality, may a truth seeker really continue on this path. And only by becoming established on the path will you really attain the serenity of meditation and be able to go placidly amidst the noise and haste of this troubling material world. This is why there are 8 aspects to this form of mystic yoga, culminating in what we call samadhi, which may be considered enlightenment. Of course, everyone wants to jump right to the end and consider themselves enlightened, but in fact, it may take many years of practice to arrive at complete enlightenment. It may take many lifetimes. Personally, I've met and known many great yogis who, after years of practice, feel they're only starting out, but that is not a hindrance. They understand that they've profited greatly from developing yoga vision, from opening this third eye into the spiritual nature. So it may take some time to develop enlightenment, but don't be discouraged. In our next talk, we'll discuss the basic principles of the Eightfold Path and how to practice them. Thanks a lot. Until then, peace. Hello, my name is Mahayogi, and I'm going to talk a little bit about yoga and its philosophy and vision. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I wanted to talk about yoga vision. Yoga vision is best described as a way of seeing. It's a kind of X-ray vision into soul consciousness. Now, for those who reject the whole notion of consciousness, you might take this as magical thinking, but I disagree. If the soul doesn't exist, there's nothing harmful in adopting a spiritual point of view. We can give up the idea of exploitation in favor of a contemplative way of life without anyone getting hurt. The social values that accompany this way of seeing are positive. They go beyond humanism. Humanism involves a kind of Faustian bargain, a selling of the soul to the devil, if you will. And we've struck this bargain with the help of a certain kind of mythology, and that's the mythology of science and exploitation. We seem to believe faithfully that science will solve all our problems with the miracle of technology, but in fact, we see this is very far from the truth. Just look around and take a look at the coronavirus, for example, and you can see how this is a reaction to endless exploitation of the material nature. But I'm not going to get into a criticism of material nature. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'm going to take about 5 or 6 minutes to describe what's called yoga vision, and I hope that you'll profit from it. I've been asked to share what I've learned from my teacher, from my guru. His name was Bhakti Rakshak Sridhar Dev Goswami. In fact, he taught me a lot of things, but one of the important things that he taught was how to see. Now, I'm not describing an ideology. In fact, once you learn to see things more clearly, you'll see that you'll come in conflict with different ideologies, because ideologies are meant to force us to live according to a certain pattern. But we're not here to advocate you're following a leader, a guru. I'm not here to take your money or get famous. I'm not interested in the number of likes I get on Facebook or Instagram. I'm not trying to turn myself into a prophet or anything like that, but I have been asked again and again to share what I've learned. And as you can see, I'm in good health for a man my age. I've lived a long time. I won't say how long, but maybe I know something. Maybe you'll learn something by giving me a few minutes of your time. I promise I won't take too much. I don't expect anything in return. I don't claim to be a guru or a prophet. I'm a long-time student of yoga and its philosophy, and I've seen how it's benefited my life. And I teach. And I teach because I was asked to explain what I've learned, and because good students also learn by teaching. So I'm trying to share what I learned from my teacher. This is how we repay our debt to the elders and the ancients and those who are in deep consciousness. And I hope it'll be useful to you. So I'm happy you're taking a few minutes out of your busy day. Now everything is online, and we live in virtual realities, so I'm glad that you're sharing this virtual space with me. Now, I've been studying yoga and its philosophy for a long time, since the 1960s. That was almost 60 years ago. It seems that many of these ideas are still very new to me, even though they're ancient truths and they're very deep. So I'm not speaking as someone who claims to be a master. Anyone who claims to be a master is really a fool in disguise, but I speak as a friend, someone who has spent some time on the path, and maybe we're on the same path together. Maybe I can see a bit farther down the road. It gives me a lot of pleasure to be able to connect with people online like this, so many sincere folks, young and old, those of you who are on the path of enlightenment, and maybe we can learn something on the path together. But particularly, I want to speak about the vision of yoga. In other words, how a real yogi sees things, both in a spiritual way and in a material way. How do we look at the world through the lens of yoga, or what I'm going to call here yoga vision? The idea is to go beyond a superficial or perfunctory understanding. Now, we all know that yoga is a great way to stay fit, to stay flexible physically, to tune the instrument, which is this human body. There are many different systems now in the West for teaching yoga. There's Iyengar yoga, integral yoga. We have International Yoga Day. Millions of people celebrate together the yoga asanas of the solar morning meditation. And the benefits of yoga exercise are well known. Uh, I know this. I've practiced yoga and I'm still pretty fit after 66 years. But the point I'm trying to make is that yoga is not simply a question of doing physical exercise. This is why some people tend to think that it might be dangerous. This could be a dangerous ideology to brainwash you. But nothing is further from the truth. This is a non sectarian means of developing a deeper kind of vision. The idea is we're not using yoga simply to tune the instrument of this material body made of flesh, bone, and muscle. But we're interested also in keeping the mind in tune. The body, as we know, is dependent on the mind. And then there's the Atma, the spiritual entity that gives life to the body and energy to the mind. How do we keep these things in balance in this high-speed materialistic world in which we're presently ensconced? In a strict sense, all the different yoga paths are meant to bring body, mind, and spirit together in harmony, but not simply to adjust or align the bone and muscle of the physical body, but to create a kind of spiritual harmony. And this is impossible without cultivating the right vision, the right way of seeing things. So if you'll give me a few minutes here, I'll try to explain. The idea of yoga vision comes from the original yoga system as it was practiced in India for thousands of years since the Vedic times. Now, this yoga system was encoded by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, and he conceived of the system as an eightfold path. Now, the ancient yoga system mirrors the eightfold path of the Buddha, but there are some important distinctions, as we'll see as we go along. The Eightfold Path has four distinct pairs. There is asana, yama, niyama, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyan, and samadhi. That sounds a bit technical, but it's worth going over in detail. Now, you advanced yoga students will understand my point of reference here, but even if you're an expert, you may still profit from my explanation because true yogis are always open to reflection. So stay tuned. You might learn something new. Newer students may have heard of this Eightfold Path, but it remains quite mysterious. The idea is that proper practice will bring us into harmony. Of course, by practice, we don't mean mere physical practice in the sense of proper diet and exercise, but also practice in terms of right vision, mindfulness, and spiritual meditation. These are different principles which will help us fine-tune our instruments. Now, the correct practice of the Eightfold Yoga Path is not easy. Even before entering into the details of the practice, it must be pointed out that we need to control the mind. Only when one's mind is correctly focused on the Atma can a truth seeker continue on this path. Only when one is firmly established on the path is it possible to access the serenity of meditation. This is why there are 8 aspects to this form of mystic yoga. And this culminates in what's called samadhi, which may be considered as enlightenment, the real goal of yoga. Now, it's very easy and self-serving to think of oneself as enlightened or advanced enough to practice at this stage. But, in fact, it may take many years of practice. I personally have met and known many great yogis who still feel that they're only starting out. But these yogis have profited greatly from developing yoga vision. In other words, you may not have achieved complete and total illumination, but you're no longer in darkness. Enlightenment may be achieved in a moment, or it may take a lifetime. So in our next talk, we'll discuss the basic principles of the Eightfold Yoga Path. And until then, thank you for listening. Peace, Om, and we'll see you next time. Stay tuned to this space. Hi, this is Maha Yogi again. As you can see, I'm in my little studio here, and I have a lot of books. I've read all of them, so you don't have to. Yoga is about the body and how to get a better one, but it's also about the mind and how to enrich your mind. So, we're discussing some basic ideas here about yoga and how to see things the way yogis see things, how to see things with the particular vision of the yogi. Yoga practice is not a religion, it's a non-sectarian way of viewing reality, but it is meant to be taken seriously. Yoga is not a joke, as sometimes seen in groups that practice naked yoga or laughing yoga. Western people like to mock the yoga practice, but this is not simply a way to see half-naked girls in their Lululemon leotards stretching their legs and showing off. We have said that beauty is the highest conception of the sweet absolute, but we're not talking about the beauty of the girls in the yoga class. We're talking about a higher conception of spirituality. So to reap the true benefits of yoga, this system should be carefully practiced by one whose mind is controlled. The ancients recommend that it should be done in a quiet and secluded place where one may easily control the mind and senses. Certain natural surroundings, such as the banks of rivers, a mountain top, the ocean side, a green space, may be particularly conducive to meditation, since these places have a calming effect on the mind. But this is not always possible. Sometimes we live in cities, there's cars, big buildings, traffic, noise, loud music. So it's not always possible to escape all the noise and distraction, but yoga is a way of providing us with an internal escape, or even better yet, a balanced way of seeing things. And so asanas and different yoga postures may contribute to bodily and mentally health, and this aids in spiritual realization, meditation on the sun, being mindful of one's place in the universe. But real meditation shouldn't end when we roll up the yoga mat. It shouldn't begin when we do our yoga exercises. The idea is to put yoga vision into practice by maintaining the inner balance that we've achieved through meditation during our entire day. Now, in order to reach that inner balance and practice yoga, it's nice to have a quiet place where we can enter a meditative state, undisturbed by relatives, friends, business, visitors. A secluded space is important, since the presence of all these things may distract the mind. But these standards are very difficult to achieve, so we have to try to create a mental space. The noise and trouble around us makes it difficult to practice yoga. That's why it's important to try to still the mind. And again, this is possible through proper vision. So It's not so much a question of setting aside a meditation room in your house or a place at your business where you can achieve quiet. It's more a question of cultivating a steady mind. The Bhagavad Gita points out that a lamp in a windless place does not waver, but we're always buffeted about by the winds of change. So we need to try to keep the mind steady. How is this possible? Well, we can keep the mind steady by adopting a spiritual point of view, by understanding the Atma within and the Atma without. Within all of us, there's a particle of spiritual eternity, if you will, spiritual consciousness. And we can come in contact with that by vibrating the sacred syllable Om, which is the universal sound. Even if you're saturated with all kinds of sound and distraction, you can hear the sound of Om in the background. So there's all different ways of meditation. Sometimes we're told to keep the eyes half open and half closed without focusing our vision on anything in particular, hold our glance towards the tip of the nose. The point is that one is alert, not asleep. In this way, one's mind becomes serene and free from materialistic agitation. We forget the impulses of sex, the need for getting money, the demands of power and politics. Instead of obsessing on the past or making plans for the future, we concentrate on existence itself in the form of the Atma. We find this spiritual flow that is moving within us and without us, discover the eternal, and try to meditate on the self, on divinity within and without. So we talked about yama and niyama, which means rules and regulations. At this point, we can talk about the idea of proper breath control, or pranayama. Pranayama has to do with the life force. Prana is the life force of the heart and the lung. And yama is regulation, as we have seen. So pranayama has to do with proper breathing. Oftentimes we become so wrapped up in the pressures of life that we forget to breathe properly. And this is the cause of many diseases and infirmities. As we go about our business, we breathe involuntarily without even thinking about it. But sometimes it's a good practice to pay attention to how we're breathing. Now, certain exercises may be given by your teacher, but pranayama means to regulate the breath properly, to attain a perfect balance. So this means that the breathing should be kept regular and smooth. There's a vital connection between the life air and the mind's true harmony. You could try a little exercise. I like to show this to my students. You can check with your guru to see if this is something that he wants you to do, but you can take your hands like this and feel the energy between your hands, and then make a little energy ball, and then expand the ball. Feel the movement. You can feel the electricity flowing between your hands. Now breathe in and breathe out. It's as simple as that. Try it again. One more time. Don't you feel better? So there's a vital connection between the life air and the mind's true harmony. In the old days, people thought that the mind was in the heart, in here, because so much of our feeling comes from the heart chakra. Now we like to think that the mind is up here. But in any case, there's a connection between breath and the harmony of the mind. Breath and life air flow from the heart. There's a relation then between an uncontrolled breath and an agitated heart, between improper breathing and heart disease. Proper breathing and a peaceful heart go hand in hand. So when one derives maximum energy through breathing, it becomes easier to turn off worries, to calm the mind, and center the mind on our inner consciousness and beyond to the higher self. By holding oneself in harmony, one comes to the realization that the soul is eternal. And in this way, one enters meditation proper. There we begin to experience the inner light of the soul while developing an awareness, consciousness of the Supreme Soul, Paramatma, who exists within and without. So by maintaining proper balance or harmony between the life breath and the heart, the mind and the higher sense, a practitioner of yoga begins to achieve serenity. Now, we've discussed yama and niyama, or proper balance in one's life path by following a certain kind of discipline. We talked about maintaining the postures by asana and also pranayama, or proper breathing. In our next talk, we'll finish discussing the Eightfold Path of Yoga. Thanks for tuning in. This is Maha Yogi. Peace. Hi, this is Maha Yogi, and I'm talking about the Eightfold Path of Yoga. So watch the earlier videos and you can catch up. They're short. The next step in the Eightfold Path, as defined by Patanjali, is called pratyahara. Now, pratyahara means withdrawal from negative practices. This is very similar to the idea of yama and niyama, but the difference is one of perspective. In yama and niyama, we're trying to follow the rules and regulations that have been set down. By the time we reach pratyahara, we understand that there's certain outlooks that are positive and certain points of view that are negative in our practice. So as one begins to see things in a proper perspective through the practice of yoga vision, we determine that certain practices hinder our spiritual vision, just as an unclean mirror loses the power of reflection. So how do we keep the mirror of the mind clean enough to provide us with proper and balanced reflection? Certain practices that distract us should be left aside, but also not simply practices, but also points of view, attitudes, if you like. For example, anger, the madness of greed, acquisition, lust, promiscuity, selfishness, cruelty. As long as we're obsessed with getting and spending, taking and exploiting, anger, we can't see that this short life is not the be-all and the end-all. So pratyahara means now our perspective has become corrected by our yoga practice. And instead of being blinded by ignorance and passion, where we seek spiritual satisfaction in the phantasms of sensual pleasure, which lasts only moments, we have a deeper idea, a more balanced concept of pleasure. Pleasure is not only material. Material pleasure is like an eczema, where your body is burning and you want to scratch the itch. But it's the worst thing you can do. It only makes the infection worse. And in our attempts to scratch the itch, we flay our skin to a pulp. It's a terrible experience. You get a very sweet pleasure from scratching, but it only damages your skin and makes things worse. In this stage of yoga, we begin to understand the importance of consciousness and see that the entire material spectacle that surrounds us is something like an iceberg floating in a sea of consciousness. True reality is eternal. What we're seeing is temporal. Nothing is eternal. You can visit the same place 2 or 3 days in a row and you'll see how it's changed. I'm from Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, houses disappear, city blocks disappear, restaurants disappear, places of work disappear, and new things pop up in their place. So this world and everything in it, in a sense, is an illusion because it's temporary. And we can keep this in mind by focusing on the eternal nature of consciousness. But as long as we focus exclusively on the physical world and its pleasures, we lose sight of consciousness and our real eternal inheritance as spirit souls. So pratyahara means beginning to come to terms with these phantasms and leaving them aside. So this becomes a question of vision. As I said before, real yoga practice is not merely physical. It involves developing a new way of seeing things. Someone who's a master of a trade, a concert musician, for example, a high-level athlete, they know that they have to give up certain bad habits in order to cultivate the right vision towards their craft or trade. And trade, this takes some time, this takes some practice. So as you mature in your yoga practice, you should be developing what we're calling here yoga vision. And here we're trying to emphasize two important points. One is detachment from the finite and transitory world and its sensual pleasures, and a cultivation of the inner sense and an understanding of the eternal pleasure of consciousness. And you will find that this advances in a twofold manifestation. On the one side, there has to be some sacrifice. It's not possible to maintain an obsession with material lust, anger, greed, gain, profit, money, and at the same time develop inner spiritual wisdom. It's important to develop the idea of sacrifice. So non-attachment to the fruits of work. This doesn't mean that you're not interested in becoming expert in what you do. I'm not trying to preach a kind of fatalism by saying none of this matters, it's all temporary anyway, we're going to die. I'm trying to point out that there's a higher level of renunciation that is not merely self-abnegation, but involves non-attachment to the fruits of work and renunciation in the spirit of divine love. So in terms of a positive cultivation of yoga vision, we're trying to learn how to witness the true nature of the Atma and the ontology of the self. So dry renunciation is not where it's at either. This is a false door. True enlightenment will come through a spirit of dedication and divine love. This is the essence of Krishna's message to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, especially in the 6th chapter where he discusses the idea of Ashtanga or Eightfold Yoga. So detachment should be based on spiritual enlightenment, which is also a question of dedication. And this sort of dedication we can develop with the help of our spiritual guide, the Guru, who will teach us how to become absorbed properly in the right kind of meditation. Uh, Now this practice is not easy. That's why I'm taking my time to explain it in little bits and pieces. I could give a 2-hour lecture, but I don't want to put everyone to sleep. Even 10 minutes is enough to put everyone asleep. But the problem is that the mind is naturally attached to the objects of the senses. And so, of course, animals don't have any problem with unrestricted eating, sleeping, fighting, sexual reproduction. But in the human form of life, we can go deeper. We could try to discover the unlimited realm of consciousness that lies beneath the surface of this material attitude. Uh, the problem is the mind is not easy to control. So yoga and proper yoga vision, or controlling the mind, it's a question of constant practice. And by practice, I don't mean forcing yourself to do something unnatural. As I said before, this is not an ideology, uh, but it's a question of learning to see things properly. If you can see the spirit soul everywhere, if you can see yourself as an eternal particle of spiritual reality, and other people also, then it will change your perspective. Uh, Instead of getting angry that someone is disrespecting you for some reason, you can try to put yourself in their place and understand, here's a spiritual soul before me, trapped in a material body, suffering in the material world. So we need to develop compassion as well, because this will help you to focus your spiritual or your yogic vision. So, as I'm trying to explain, this is a kind of practice that it's not really a question of an hour or two a week. You roll out your yoga mat and do a few exercises. The goal really of yoga is what's called samadhi, which means uh, enlightenment, if you like. We'll talk more about samadhi later. But to enter into a perfect state of yogic trance or samadhi, where one's mind is free from materialistic mental activities, is not easy. Even daily meditation may not lead you into a state of complete enlightenment. Progress is slow. But whatever progress you make on the path won't be lost, and the slightest effort is never wasted. This is an important aspect of human life, trying to visualize yourself as consciousness, as spirit, and trying to go closer to the Supreme Spirit. So if your only idea of yoga is physical health, that's fine. But I'm talking about the Eightfold Path of Patanjali that was developed thousands of years ago. And this is meant to benefit us in many other ways. Most of you advanced yoga students may already know this. You may be using yoga to relieve back pain or to have a better sex life, or simply to tune your instrument so you can face the stress of daily life, which is so karmically based. But if that's your only motivation, you're missing out on something even more important. Our current way of life is based on karmic exploitation, and everything today is geared toward profiting, making more money. But step back for a moment and consider how damaging this way of life is. I don't want to dwell on negativity and problems. There's plenty of social critics. But this money madness seems to color everything we do in our work and our relationships. And in the last century or so, it seems, we've built an entire way of life based on a very intense karmic exploitation of the planet, including its water, its air, energy, the earth itself. Even our emotional relationships are colored by exploitation. Everything is monetized, even these videos. The whole karmic idea of exploitation colors our practice of yoga. Now, the idea is to get yourself in shape so that you can work harder and be more productive member of the machine. Factories and workplaces offer yoga as a kind of psychological support to help workers cope with stress so they can return to their stressful occupations. The idea being to use yoga to relax your nerves before you go back to soul-killing work, which involves destroying the planet. But we can go deeper. So that's why I'm talking about the Eightfold Path here. It's not just the asanas. Apart from the helpful asanas that we can use to adjust our physical instruments, there are more useful exercises to adjust our mental instrument. One of these is meditation. I haven't really spoken about that, but that's coming up next. We looked at yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara. The next two steps are called dharana and dhyana. Dharana means focus, mindfulness, whereas dhyana is meditation. But if you only use meditation just to adjust yourself mentally so you can continue with karmic exploitation, you're missing out on the proper vision that will guide you to a higher level. Sometimes people talk about vision and they say, oh, I have a vision of a brilliant future where all my goals are achieved. But vision also really means the capacity to see what is. So again, we're not promoting an ideology here. We're trying to describe the importance of being able to see reality as it is. So the idea is that when one becomes properly balanced through yama and niyama regulations, proper breathing, harmonic life, right action, pranayama, pratyahara, then one's ready for the next step. And this next step is a twofold process called dharana, or focus, and dhyan, meditation. More on this next time. And I'd like to thank you again for tuning in and listening to these short talks. This is Mahayogi. Peace. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. It's good to see you here. In our last talk, we were looking at the idea of pratyahara, talking about the Eightfold Yoga Path. This is one in a series, so thanks for joining us today and spending about 10 minutes. I hope I don't take too much of your time. I know everyone's very busy. In our last talk, we were talking about the idea of pratyahara. This is a Sanskrit word. And I discussed this in very sort of broad terms in a non-technical way, because you can talk about the idea of pratyahara or anything else on the Eightfold Yoga Path as being very specific to a technique. Or you can think of the yoga system as a path, as something to be applied in your daily life. And in that case, this is not simply a technique. In the West, we like to think of everything in a technological way. We like to break things down and learn how to do them so we can repeat them again and again and get the same result. So if the end result of yoga is to have a peaceful mind, then we want to understand, well, what is a technique by which I can do that? And I think Western culture is very much geared to this point of view, so that everything is seen in terms of a technique, from love to work to uh, playing music to anything else. It's all about the technique. And if you can learn the technique, then you can be a big success. So you can think of pratyahara as part of a technique that you can apply uh, in your yoga exercise itself. Or you can think of the whole yoga system as applying to your daily life. How can I improve my daily life through this kind of practice? And a practice and a technique are very different concepts. Uh, so the idea of pratyahara, in terms of practice, it means giving up what's unfavorable to your spiritual advancement. And that's a kind of a general meaning. And you can apply this to many different things. Giving up bad habits, leaving aside what's unfavorable to your yoga practice. And of course, in a more technical sense, you can apply this to the technique of meditation. And in that sense, in a more limited sense, if we apply this to meditation technique, the idea of pratyahara means to leave aside distractions or to withdraw the senses from external phenomena. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna uses the example of a turtle. He says that just as a turtle withdraws his limbs within his shell, so the yogi withdraws his consciousness from the senses and their stimulus. So the idea of pratyahara is the idea of withdrawing the mind from the senses. And this is really key to proper meditation, or to focusing the mind. But we talked about pratyahara. The next step in the Eightfold Path has more to do with focus. So if pratyahara means giving up unfavorable things, and in this sense, particularly giving up distractions by withdrawing the mind from the senses, the next step is called dharana. And dharana really means to hold something together, to focus, if you like. If you've missed our earlier discussion, just to go back over the Eightfold Path, there's yama and niyama, which are the do's and don'ts, or trying to balance ourselves by correct practice. And after achieving some kind of balance, we're ready to go deeper. We're ready for meditation. So again, this is not just a question of following some technique when we sit down to meditate, but the idea is to try to regulate our lives so that we're at least on a more human level. We're leaving behind animal practices, if you like, because the real human goal of life should be a spiritual one, as it says in the Vedanta Sutra, atato brahma jigyasa. Atato, now. Jigyasa means inquiry. So now is the time to inquire into the nature of spirit. And what does it mean by now? Well, the commentators agree that now means now that you have the human form of life. So, let's say that we've accepted a certain amount of regulation in our life, a certain amount of discipline. Our next step is, how are we going to meditate properly? So we want to align ourselves by sitting properly. We find a harmonious asana and perform pranayama, which means to breathe correctly. So we breathe. And even so, our mind is still distracted. We have 101 million things that we're thinking about every day. So we try to clear the distractions by withdrawing the mind from the senses, or pratyahara. So we've done asana, yama, niyama, pranayama, and pratyahara. So now we come to the sixth part, the sixth aspect of the Eightfold Path of Yoga. And our next stop on the path of Eightfold Yoga is called dharana. Now, you may notice there's a similarity between this word dharana and the word dharma. Well, they both come from the same Sanskrit root, which is drit. And this means what sustains. Dharma means what sustains us or what holds us together. And it's often used in the sense of religion, because what holds you together and what keeps you going, you could say that's your religion. Now, dharana is a little different. It means holding the mind together or having a balanced, sustained mind. In other words, you could say that dharana means concentration or focus. An example of focus can be found in the Mahabharata, when Dronacharya is teaching the sons of the Pandavas the skill of archery. He takes them out into the forest and he places a wooden bird high. He has one of his students place a wooden bird high in a tree, and the wooden bird has a tiny eye made of ivory, beautifully decorated. And then one by one he instructs his students, all right, that's your target. And he says, all right, hold the bow, now focus, and beginning with Duryodhana, he says, what do you see, Duryodhana? And Duryodhana looks, and he says, well, the sky is blue, I see the tree, I see the tree branches, and Dronacharya tells him, stop. Bhima, you go. Hold the bow. Pull the arrow. What do you see? And Bhima says, I see the branch of the tree, and there's the bird. And Drona says, all right, the whole bird? Yes, I can describe it. Well, it's a beautiful handmade bird. What do you want me to say? All right, forget it. Arjun, hold the bow. All right, focus. What do you see? And Arjun says, I see the eye of the bird. Yes, that's the target. Do you see anything else? No. Do you see the tree? No. Do you see the branch? No. Only the bird? Only the eye of the bird. And Dronacharya says, good. You understand. You can shoot. Very good, my boy. So, the idea of dharana is the idea of focusing or holding the mind steady. And we understand this. We focus on work, we focus on money, playing sports, getting a girlfriend, having a good relationship. But this is different kind of focus. In yoga, our focus is on the living self, the Atma, the soul consciousness within. And even this is a primitive level. We'll talk about that later. But at least focusing on consciousness should be our goal. This is the eye of the bird, so to speak. And how do we discover the soul within, or the consciousness? Different philosophers like to play around with the idea of the mind-body problem. René Descartes, modern philosophers try to pretend that consciousness doesn't exist, even while it's the source of all your thinking. So how does consciousness become intuitive? How does it become self-evident through meditation? Well, consciousness, the Atma, becomes self-evident as soon as you still the different thought processes of the mind. So in the dharana stage, we have an intermittent experience of the inner soul, but our problem is our awareness of soul consciousness continues to be interrupted by thoughts, desires, images of past and future. It's very difficult to avoid thinking about our past mistakes or worrying about what faces us in the future. And so at this point, mantra meditation is especially useful to help free the mind from unnecessary burdens of materialistic life. The mantra helps free us from ruminating over the past or brooding about the future. The mantra helps us to intuitively realize the eternal by freeing us from past, future, and even the present. So this idea of dharana, meditation, is really an initial stage of becoming aware of the self. It's a kind of midway point between ordinary consciousness and deeper meditation, where we begin to focus on the Atma, even while the mind is still dealing with a certain amount of distraction. Now, since the Atma is a deeper state of reality than the mind, it's very external to try to experience the Atma with the mind, which is what some people try to do in meditation, and they become very frustrated by this because the intelligence is metacognitive. So, with your intelligence, you could try to analyze the mind trying to experience the soul. But this is very strange. It's just something like going outside your house and looking in your window to see if you're home. So this kind of metacognitive analysis interferes with meditation, and it should be left aside in the deeper stages of meditation, as we shall see in this concept of dhyan, or constant meditative state. We're trying to experience the Atma intuitively as self-evident reality, even while the mind is still busy. So by the help of the mantra, we still the mind, and this enables us to discover our own inner consciousness. So the dharana level, it's kind of a way station. We're wavering between trying to still the impulses of the mind and the impulses of the senses, and still very much in the metacognitive stage, where the intelligence monitors the mind and wonders, is this sort of meditation working? Our mind is busy thinking about, should I get a sandwich? Should I talk to that pretty girl sitting over there? We hover between inner peace and outer anxiety. We're not quite there yet. Mind is still telling us, I'm cold, I'm hot, I'm hungry, this is boring, let's do something else. Our intelligence works on a higher level. It says, no, keep trying, this is good for you, focus. We're wondering, is this a good idea? We're conscious of the act of meditating, and our intelligence weighs the value of this kind of focus against so many other things we might be focusing on. So dharana, this particular stage, involves the attempt to go beyond metacognition to a deeper intuition of the self. Let me give you an example. If you've ever tried to juggle, you'll find the mind trying to organize when to catch and when to throw. But as long as your mind is busy analyzing the catching and the throwing, you'll drop your balls on the floor. You can only juggle when you stop thinking about it. And this is true of many different skills, from driving a car to playing the guitar to speaking another language. You have to get in the zone, so to speak. As long as you try to stop and analyze how to speak French or how to speak Chinese, you'll be tongue-tied. You have to somehow immerse yourself in the moment and get in the zone. And then you can master a language. And this is true of language, music, mathematics, art, athletics, and even archery, as in the case of Arjuna in the Mahabharata. So, as you can see, dharana is an advanced beginner stage of yoga, but it's still an intermediate one. And as we become more advanced in what I'm calling here yoga vision, it will become clear that this is really a new way of seeing. It's not simply a physical or even mental meditative practice. This is really what's meant by opening the third eye. But even in the stage of dharana, the third eye is still not quite open. Our vision is hazy. There's a glimpse of light in the darkness, but we haven't quite arrived. The next stage on our journey through the Eightfold Path is called dhyan, or meditation. But we'll talk about that next time. Thanks for tuning in. This is Mahayogi. Peace. On a particular level, being calm is not the only thing that yoga will reveal. So we come to the idea of dhyan. Now, dhyan, normally we think of meditation. This is sort of the popular idea. Meditation on what is the problem? Are we meditating on a candle, a rose, the sky? And then what do we mean by meditation? If we're sitting and looking at a candle, well, you could call that contemplation as well, making the mind still, mindfulness. So really the word meditation is a bit unfortunate. It doesn't really get to the true purpose of dhyan. But the followers of a particular Swami in India in the 1960s tried to sort of patent that term and use it in their marketing of their particular school of yoga. Nowadays, everything is commercialized. So people try to make money off everything. There's an interesting poem by Pablo Neruda called Oda al Aire, where he says, please don't sell the air. But now even the air is up for sale. And so thinking and meditation are all part of that process. But I'm not trying to sell you something here, just giving a simple explanation of the basic eightfold yoga path. Part of what I'm doing here is I'm trying to understand how to use Facebook, YouTube, videos. I'm a teacher, and so now everything is remote. Everything is online. It's all technology. So I have to know how to use this technology, and I thought I would warm up a little bit by speaking about yoga and taking that as my subject. My point here is that yoga is really a mystic process. In this sense, we're trying to come in contact with our spiritual self. Now, what exactly does that mean? It's a problem because we get involved in ideology, we get involved in dogma. Everyone has their own religious backstory, the religious baggage that they carry around with them. But religion as such is more of a social problem. It's something that your mommy and daddy teach you when you're 3 or 4 years old, that you should worship your God, and your God is Allah, or his name is Jesus, or his name is Shiva. And so the names that we learn and the church that we go to kind of define our social identity, but it has nothing really to do with who we are. Uh, the dangerous thing about yoga is it puts us in touch with who we really are, and that's social identities. So sometimes in different parts of the world, yoga suddenly becomes kind of a controversial thing. People don't want to talk about it. They think somehow you'll be subverted or hypnotized, or this is a pagan practice. So they don't like thinking or dhyan or meditation or contemplation, because you're not really supposed to. You're supposed to be a robot and push the button and do what you're told. But let's just talk about the meaning of the word dhyan. Sanskrit's interesting. The words in Sanskrit have deep meanings. These terms have been in use for a long time. And different schools sort of appropriate the meaning of a word. And so over 1,000, 2,000 years, even though there's an assigned meaning, there's only one particular meaning to a Sanskrit root, and it's thousands of years old. How could it have more than one meaning? But because different schools adopt terminology and use that terminology in a special way, so we become accustomed to thinking of certain words having certain meanings. It might surprise you to learn that the word Zen comes from dhyan, but we normally think of dhyan as meditation, but there's different kinds of meditation, aren't there? There's the Buddhist meditation, there's the Shankarite meditation, there's what we call mindfulness now. Sometimes we find there's so much stress in modern life that people need to do something to escape the stress for a while so that they can come back again and take up the stress. So now in factories, we have programs for yoga. And prisons, we have programs for mindfulness. Now, if you're living in a prison, you don't really want to be mindful of what's going on there. But the idea is to cool people down, have them relax, get their minds off work and problems. And so the idea of dhyan or mindfulness meditation has been used in that sense. But staring at a blank wall and making your mind blank is not really the purpose of the Eightfold Yoga system. Patanjali perfected a system for going deeper into our own selves and trying to understand our personal realities. So how is dhyan and how does it work? If dharana involves focus and freedom from distraction, dhyan involves a deeper kind of concentration, a deeper kind of meditation. For example, as I'm doing this video, there's a dog barking over outside that window. So how do you continue your meditation when a dog is barking? And that's very simple. It's a very simple distraction. What about, there you go. I don't know if you can hear that. What about when your parents are telling you that you're doing it wrong? Your teacher tells you you're doing it wrong. The society tells you you're doing it wrong. How do you maintain your balance and your focus? You may have a particular vision. You may think you understand what you're about. And society tells you, no, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. How do you maintain your balance? So the idea of dharana and dhyan, or focus and meditation, have to do with keeping in mind the goal of self-knowledge, of self-realization, of knowing who we are and coming in contact with the eternal self. Now, that's not so easy. Self-realization is a tricky business. As long as we're dominated by a particular ideology, uh, as long as we think, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm Russian, I'm German, I'm Mexican, I'm American, we fool ourselves into thinking that we're self-realized when really we're simply recycling the old formulas. So now I calmed my mind, I'm still, and I'm ready to go back to work and be exactly who I was before. Well, we're missing the point of the yoga system. Uh, the idea is to uncover the inner self. And for those of you who are involved in a particular yoga system, uh, you might think that I'm being vague here, and it's true. I'm being a little indirect because I'm trying to speak very broadly. I'm trying to give a definition of the Eightfold Path as it was first seen by Patanjali. But you'll see that over the millennium that had passed since he first developed his system, it's been seen and adjusted in different light by different teachers. And I'm going to talk about more of that in a later series that I'll be developing here. But as I said before, I'm trying to get used to using this medium, YouTube, doing a video. It's very tricky and very difficult for me. I have to keep in mind everything from the proper codes that I have to enter in order to live stream something, to whether my microphone works all right. I have to keep a lot of different things in mind. So you can forgive me, please, if my first few videos are a little bit rustic and the quality is not so good. Uh, I'm trying to learn how to do this. So please be patient. And patience is another factor in the yoga system. So there we go. Now, you might think I'm being a little bit vague and indirect here, and I am. But I'm trying to give a very general definition of these different terms: yama, niyama, dharana, dhyan, pranayam, pratyahara, asana. So in our next little video, we'll talk about samadhi, which is also very popular. So different teachers will teach you focusing, mindfulness, focus on a candle, focus on a flower. It's not really dhyan. It may be meditation in the modern sense, but it doesn't really have much to do with yoga as it was conceived. The idea is to come in contact with your eternal self, your eternal nature. So you could say that true yoga involves meditation on the self. So I think this is an important point, because people get stopped before they come to meditation because they think, well, what am I meditating on? I need to have an object for my meditation. So they get this advice: well, meditate on a flower, meditate on the wall, meditate on a light. It doesn't matter what you meditate on. The idea is to blank the mind. This is not true. We're not meditating on material things. We're not meditating on the flower or the wall. We're not even meditating on the mind. We're trying to get a sense of soul experience, which means need to leave cognition and the ego behind, but that's very difficult to do because the mind is always thinking. So if I tell you to still the mind, for example, then what happens is you get trapped in this thinking process where you go, okay, how do I, am I not thinking now? I think I'm not thinking. But this is not exactly the goal of meditation. The goal of meditation, again, is to try to separate illusion from reality or consciousness from matter. This is why mantras work. Mantras are very important because divine sound actually has a liberating effect as we involve ourselves more deeply in the sound. We leave behind cognition and metacognition, thinking and rethinking and overthinking things, and discover the eternal self separate from the physical body through this sort of process of contemplation or dhyan. So this is really the question that we're trying to take up here in the process of dhyan.